I used to believe that meaning was something big, something you found at the peak of a mountain or in a life-changing moment. But the truth is, meaning sneaks up on you in the small, ordinary moments of your life. And if you're not paying attention, you'll miss it. A few years ago, I was rushing through my day, running late again, when my daughter called out, "Mom, did you see that?" I barely glanced up. "See what?" She pointed to a patch of sunlight coming through the window, making dust particles dance in the air. "That," she whispered, as if it were the most magical thing in the world. And in that moment, something hit me. How many of these moments had I already missed? We spend so much of our lives chasing the next thing, checking things off our to-do list, waiting for the weekend, the promotion, the big break, believing that meaning is somewhere out there. But what if the moments that matter most are the ones we overlook? Here's what I've learned. Small moments are where real connection happens. Research shows that the strongest relationships aren't built on grand gestures, but on everyday interactions. Eye contact, a shared joke, a simple "how was your day?" These moments tell the people in our lives, "I see you, you matter." I used to believe connection was something you had to work hard for. Deep conversations, perfectly planned date nights, grand gestures of love and friendship. And sure, those things can be beautiful, but that's not what holds relationships together. What actually makes or breaks our relationships are the tiny, almost invisible moments we often don't think twice about. John Gottman, one of the most well-respected researchers in relationship science, studied couples for decades. He found that the difference between couples who thrive and couples who struggle isn't big romantic getaways or extravagant gifts. It's what he calls bids for connection. Small, everyday moments where one person reaches out, sometimes in the subtlest way, and the other person responds. Picture this: a couple is sitting at the breakfast table. One of them, let's say the husband, looks out the window and says, "Wow, look at that bird outside." The wife has three choices in that moment. She can turn toward and engage. "Oh yeah, that's beautiful." She can turn away and ignore it, or she can turn against and dismiss it. I'm trying to read. Gottman found that in the happiest couples, partners turn toward each other 87% of the time. In struggling relationships, it was closer to 30%. And here's what really hits. It's never about the bird. It's about the message beneath it. Are you there? Do you see me? And it's not just romantic relationships. Friendships, parent-child bonds, even work relationships are built on these tiny moments of connection. But here's the kicker. Most of us don't even realize when we're turning away. Not because we don't care, but because we're distracted. We're on our phones, buried in emails, lost in our own thoughts. We assume connection will happen in the big moments, vacations, birthdays, long heart-to-hearts. But if we're missing the small moments, we're missing everything. I had a friend once tell me that when her dad picked her up from school, he always had a habit of flipping down the sun visor and checking himself in the mirror. She never thought much of it. Years later, after he passed away, she found herself sitting in her own car, flipping down the visor just to see her reflection. And she realized, this was one of our moments. It wasn't deep talks or grand life lessons. It was this: the tiny rituals, the unspoken routines, the familiarity of just being together. If you've ever lost someone, you know exactly what I mean. When we look back, the things we miss the most aren't the vacations or the holidays. It's the sound of their laughter from the other room, the way they always hummed when they were cooking, the way they squeezed our hand before letting go. Connection isn't built in the big moments, it's built in the spaces in between. The question is, are we paying attention? Joy is woven into the ordinary. Studies in positive psychology reveal that the people who report the highest levels of happiness aren't the ones with the most extraordinary experiences, but the ones who notice ordinary joys. Morning coffee, laughter, the way the air smells before it rains. I used to think joy was something you had to chase, something that came with the big moments, the job promotion, the vacation, the once-in-a-lifetime experiences. And yes, those things can bring happiness, but they aren't the foundation of a joyful life. The foundation is much quieter, much smaller, and if we're not paying attention, we'll miss it completely. Psychologist Sonja Lyubomirsky, who studies happiness, found that only about 10% of our happiness comes from life circumstances, things like how much money we have, what kind of job we do, or where we live. That means 90% of our well-being isn't about what happens to us, but how we engage with what's already here. And the people who describe themselves as happiest aren't necessarily the ones who've traveled the world or achieved great success. They're the ones who've learned to find joy in the small, everyday moments. But here's where it gets tricky. Our brains aren't wired for this. Our brains are wired for survival. We're designed to notice problems, threats, and what's missing, not to pause and savor the way the sunlight hits the kitchen table. And that's why joy isn't just something that happens, it's something we have to practice. I remember talking to a woman once who told me about her morning routine with her kids. Every morning it was chaos. Lunches to pack, shoes to find, backpacks half zipped, someone always forgetting something. She said she was always waiting for the moment things would slow down, for the day when mornings wouldn't be so hectic so she could finally enjoy them. But one day, her husband stopped her and said, "One day we're going to miss this." And that hit her. She realized she'd spent years treating her mornings like an obstacle to get through instead of a moment to be in. And I get it. When we're in the thick of things, it's hard to slow down. It's hard to find joy. When you're running late, when your inbox is overflowing, when life feels like one long to-do list. But joy doesn't show up in the perfect, quiet, everything's handled moments. It shows up in the messy ones. It's in the way your dog greets you at the door like you're the most important person in the world. It's in your kid's lopsided grin when they tell you a joke that doesn't make sense. It's in the smell of fresh coffee, the way your best friend says your name, the warmth of a blanket on a cold morning. And if we're always rushing, always waiting for the next thing, the next weekend, the next vacation, we won't see it. We'll walk right past it. Researcher Barbara Fredrickson calls this the broaden and build theory. When we allow ourselves to notice and experience positive emotions, even in small doses, it expands our ability to see the good in life. The more we practice noticing joy, the more our brains recognize it. It's like strengthening a muscle. So maybe joy isn't something we have to chase. Maybe it's something we have to learn how to see. Slowing down isn't a luxury. It's a necessity. Our brains are wired to seek efficiency, but meaning doesn't live in efficiency. It lives in presence. If we're always rushing, always thinking about what's next, we never fully experience what's now. For most of my life, I thought being busy meant being productive. I thought moving fast, knocking things off my to-do list, and always having something to do meant I was doing life right. But there was this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant moment that made me question everything. I was sitting at my kitchen table answering emails while my son stood next to me, telling me a story about something that happened at school. I was nodding, throwing in the occasional, "Oh wow," and "That's great, buddy," without really listening. Then he stopped mid-sentence and said, "Never mind." And I looked up. Never mind? That's not how he usually talked to me. But I could see it right there in his face. He knew I wasn't really there. That moment knocked the wind out of me because it made me realize just how often I was physically present but mentally somewhere else. And I don't think I'm alone in this. We live in a world that glorifies busyness, a world that tells us slowing down is lazy, that resting means we're not doing enough. But here's the problem. When we live like that, we don't actually experience our own lives. There's a study that tracked people's thoughts throughout the day, and it found that almost 47% of the time, our minds are not where our bodies are. That means nearly half our lives were somewhere else. Thinking about something we need to do, replaying something that already happened, worrying about what's coming next. And the kicker? The study found that people were the least happy when their minds were wandering. Even if they were stuck in traffic or doing something unpleasant, they were happier when they were fully present than when they were mentally elsewhere. That tells us something big. Slowing down, being present, it's not a luxury. It's not something we should only do when we have time. It's essential. Because meaning isn't something we find someday when everything is finally in order. It's something we experience only when we actually show up for our own lives. But here's the thing, slowing down is uncomfortable at first. It forces us to feel, and a lot of us stay busy because we don't want to feel. When we're constantly moving, constantly working, constantly checking our phones, we don't have to sit with the things that make us uncomfortable, the sadness, the loneliness, the uncertainty. But avoiding those feelings doesn't make them go away. It just keeps us disconnected, and disconnection is where we lose ourselves. I once heard a hospice nurse talk about what people regret most at the end of their lives. And it's never, I wish I had worked more. I wish I had been more productive. I wish I had responded to emails faster. It's always, I wish I had been there more. I wish I had paid more attention. I wish I had slowed down. So maybe the most important thing we can do isn't to do more, but to be here more, to put down the phone, to really look at the people we love when they're talking, to breathe, to stop treating life like something to get through and start treating it like something to be in. Because if we're not careful, we'll blink, and the moments we rushed past will be the very ones we wish we could get back. Gratitude isn't about being thankful for the big things. It's about paying attention to the small ones. Research from leading psychologists shows that daily gratitude practices improve well-being, not because they make us focus on more, but because they make us notice what's already here. I used to think gratitude was something that just happened naturally, something we felt when life was going well, when things were falling into place, when we had a reason to be thankful. And don't get me wrong, it's easy to feel grateful when the big things happen, the job offer, the clean bill of health, the unexpected kindness. But what I've learned, and what research overwhelmingly confirms, is that gratitude isn't just a reaction. It's a practice, a way of seeing, and most importantly, it's about the small things, the things we so often overlook. Psychologist Robert Emmons, who's one of the leading researchers on gratitude, found that people who actively practice gratitude aren't just happier, they're healthier, they have lower levels of stress, stronger immune systems, and even better sleep. But here's the part that really stuck with me. Their circumstances weren't necessarily better. They didn't have easier lives. They had the same struggles, the same challenges, the same uncertainties. The difference, they noticed the good. And that's the tricky part, isn't it? Noticing. Because our brains are wired to focus on what's missing, what's wrong, what needs fixing. That's how we survive. But when we live in that state all the time, we don't just survive, we struggle. We start moving through life without really seeing it. And gratitude is what interrupts that pattern. It says, wait, before you move on to the next thing, before you fix, before you worry, look at what's already here. There was a woman I met years ago who told me a story I'll never forget. She and her husband had this morning ritual. Every day before leaving for work, he'd make her a cup of coffee. Just a simple cup of coffee. Sometimes they'd sit and drink it together. Sometimes he'd leave it on the counter for her to grab as she rushed out the door. And for years, it was just there. Something she never really thought about until the day it wasn't. Until the morning she woke up and he was gone. And suddenly, that simple cup of coffee became the thing she missed most. Not the vacations, not the big moments, just that. The small, ordinary act of love she had overlooked. And that's what gratitude does. It makes us see the cup of coffee before it's gone. It makes us appreciate the way our partner always remembers to turn on the porch light, the way our friend texts to check in, the way our dog greets us like we've been gone for years. But let's be real, gratitude is not a magic wand. It doesn't erase pain. It doesn't mean we ignore the hard stuff or pretend everything's fine when it's not. Life can be brutal. Loss happens, uncertainty happens, and sometimes the last thing we want to do is sit around making gratitude lists. But here's what I know. Gratitude doesn't take away the hard things, but it gives us something to hold on to within them. It reminds us that even in the mess, even in the grief, there's still something good. I once heard someone say that gratitude is like a flashlight in the dark. It doesn't make the darkness disappear, but it helps you find your way through it. And maybe that's the whole point. Maybe gratitude isn't about being happy all the time. It's about noticing what's worth holding on to. And the more we practice, the more we see. Meaning isn't something we find, it's something we create, moment by moment. The idea that we'll stumble upon meaning one day fully formed and waiting for us is a myth. What research actually shows is that meaning isn't about grand revelations, it's about how we choose to engage with our lives every day. For years, I believed meaning was tied to big moments. I thought it was something you had to earn through success, through major life milestones, through the big sweeping changes that make for great stories. But the more I listened to people who had lived full, wholehearted lives, the more I realized something surprising. Meaning isn't found in the big moments, it's made in the small ones. Psychologist Michael Steger, who studies the science of meaning, found that the people who describe their lives as meaningful aren't necessarily the ones who have had extraordinary experiences. They're the ones who show up fully for their ordinary ones. They're the ones who decide over and over that this moment matters. And that's the key. It's a decision. Meaning isn't something that just happens. It's something we create through our choices, our attention, and our willingness to engage with life. Even when it's messy, especially when it's messy. I once spoke with a woman who had spent years searching for a sense of purpose. She kept waiting for that one big thing that would make her life feel meaningful, maybe a new job, a new relationship, a big adventure. But nothing ever quite clicked. One day, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table with her grandmother, peeling apples for a pie. It was nothing special, just a quiet, simple moment. But she looked up, saw the way her grandmother's hands moved, the way the light hit the kitchen window, the way the room smelled like cinnamon and warmth, and she felt it, a deep sense of belonging, a moment of meaning, and she realized, this is it. This is what I've been chasing. It wasn't in the future. It wasn't something waiting to be discovered. It was here all along. That's how meaning works. It's not a destination. It's not a prize at the end of the road. It's in the way we choose to show up for our lives, the way we listen, the way we see the people around us. And the research backs this up. Studies show that the people who report the highest levels of life satisfaction aren't the ones who have the most money or the biggest achievements. They're the ones who engage in small, meaningful moments, helping a friend, sharing a meal, creating something, even just making someone laugh. They choose to invest in the moments that matter. But let's be honest, this isn't always easy. Life is noisy, it's busy. We get caught up in the stress, the schedules, the endless list of things to do. And meaning can feel like something we'll get to later, when things slow down, when everything finally falls into place. But the hard truth is, if we're always waiting for life to feel meaningful, we might just miss it altogether. So maybe the real challenge isn't to find meaning. Maybe it's to practice it. To decide that this moment right here is enough. To choose to be present, even when it's inconvenient. To recognize that meaning isn't in the extraordinary, it's in the intentional. Because in the end, that's what it comes down to. The people we love, the stories we tell, the small moments we choose to see. And maybe, just maybe, meaning was never something we had to search for. Maybe it was here all along, just waiting for us to notice. If there's one thing I hope you take away, it's this. Meaning isn't waiting for us in some distant, perfect future. It's not something we'll find someday when life finally slows down, when everything falls into place, when we feel like we've earned it. Meaning is now. It's in the way we choose to show up, the way we pay attention, the way we decide over and over again that the smallest moments are actually the biggest ones. Because at the end of the day, our lives aren't made up of a few grand, sweeping events. They are made up of millions of tiny moments. A quiet morning, a deep belly laugh, a shared glance that says, I see you. And when we stop rushing, when we stop waiting for something bigger, when we notice, really notice those moments, that's when we realize this is what matters. This is where joy lived. So my challenge to you is simple. Pay attention. Slow down. Be here. Let yourself be moved by the small things. Because one day you'll look back and you'll realize they weren't small at all.